Good morning, second grade. Mr. Wilson back here for another story from Judges, and this one comes from chapter 4. And I told you that they get a little weird, and this story is no exception. It gets pretty crazy at the end, but I think you can handle it. And because this story is a little bit complicated, I'm going to illustrate it using these. So, these are playing cards, and if you've ever used these before, you know that the best card in this stack is this king. The next best card is the queen. The next best card is the jack. The worst card is this one. So, what is this story about? Well, in Judges chapter 4, again, Israel is having problems because a new nation, a new people, and a new king are now oppressing them. And for 20 years, they're facing problems. So, God calls this man named Barak. And in Hebrew, Barak means bless. It can also mean curse, depending on how it's used. But Barak is a great general, and he is the one that God calls to deliver the people. However, he's a little bit fearful of his job, and so he goes to a very important woman named Deborah. And there are prophets in the Old Testament, but you may not have known there is a prophetess in the Old Testament, and her name was Deborah. And Barak goes to Deborah and says, I'm not going to go do what God said to do unless you go with me. In other words, he respected her leadership and knew that the blessing of God was in her life. And so what Deborah says is, yes, I will go with you, but just so you know, Barak, the victory is going to go to a woman instead of to you. Barak seems okay with that, and so they go up against a third person. I've chosen the Jack of Diamonds. Not as good as a king or queen, but Sisera was a very successful general of the army that was oppressing Israel. And so Deborah and Barak are successful in getting Sisera to run away in the middle of battle, but they can't catch him. And he's just trying to get away with his life because he knows that they have lost. So Sisera is running away from the Israelites. He's in great danger, and he ends up running through an area that is like a little town with some tents that are all out. And there's a woman named Jael who sees him running by and calls to him and says, Sisera, come on in here and I'll keep you safe. So Sisera does that, and he goes into the tent. And Jael says to Sisera, why don't you lay down and rest for a little bit? And I'll take care of you. She gets him some milk. Now, what does that sound like? She tells Sisera to lay down. She says, I'll get you a glass of milk. She's treating Sisera like a little kid. And he's acting like a little kid. And Jael is being very smart. She's getting the upper hand. The story showing us that Jael, even though she seems to be less important and less likely to be able to win a victory for the Israelites, that she's using Sisera because he has his guard down. He wouldn't expect any danger inside the tent of this nice woman. But there is danger, and let me show you why. Jael goes and gets a tent peg and a hammer, and while Sisera is sleeping, Jael, it says in Judges 4, puts the peg against his temple, takes the hammer, and drives it right down. And that's how Sisera dies. What a way to go, with a tent peg being put into your head while you sleep. That's how Sisera, the general of the army oppressing Israel, is killed. Not by Deborah. Deborah didn't say it would be her. Deborah said that a woman rather than Barak would have the victory. So it's a surprising story. But let me tell you one other reason why it's a surprising story. Probably when I told you this story, you had this little thing in mind, which some of you might recognize as a tent peg. However, this works well here in the United States, but if you're pitching a tent on desert sand, this will do nothing. It's not going to hold down your tent because the sand isn't firm enough and it shifts around. And what you would actually have used back in the book of Judges was something about this long. Some of you might recognize that this is a yardstick. Now think about putting this into the ground. It's nice and long, it's sturdy. You have to take a pretty big hammer and pound it many, many times to get that thing well anchored in the soil. Well, guess what? This is what Jael used when she killed Sisera. There's one other reason why this is an important detail, because you see, there's a verse in Deuteronomy chapter 22 that says a woman shall not wear men's clothing. It's a law. But that verse isn't quite translated right. What it actually says is a woman will not wear something like the clothing of war, shall not wear battle armor. In other words, for the ancient Israelites, women were not supposed to be in the military. However, in Judges, in this particular instance, it's not a man who gets the victory, it's a woman. But she doesn't break the Old Testament law, because guess what? When tents would be pitched, it was the role of the woman to do that. She would have gotten this huge tent peg out and the big hammer, and in this culture, it was the woman who had the charge of pitching the tent. So, what's the point of all these interesting details? Well, to tell you the truth, because it's a fun story to listen to. When the Israelites would hear a story like this, they really would have enjoyed seeing, our unlikely hero, Jael, who is the unimportant three of hearts, get the better of not just of Sisera when she kills him with the tent peg, but even of the general who should have been doing the job himself, Barak. So if you feel a little bit like Jael this week, weak, unimportant, small, which is perhaps how she felt with everything going on in her country, remember that God uses the weak things of the world very often to bring down the proud. It says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Thanks, kids. Have a great day.